The movie starts with Henry sitting at his duty post at a toll booth for the night shift. When morning comes, he leaves and heads home where his wife, Debbie, looks like she's been waiting for him. She immediately serves him breakfast, and while he's eating, they catch up on how they're both doing, and Debbie also tries to convince Henry that she wants a baby. Before he can answer, they hear a knock at the door. And when Henry opens it, he sees his friend, Eddie, along with another man named Joe, who looked really sick and was throwing up too. Eddie asks if they come in, and as they do, Debbie, who is a nurse, helps Joe get into the bathroom where she can look at him. Meanwhile, Eddie pleads with Henry to come with him for a baseball game, since his team was now short of players, with Joe's condition preventing him from playing. Henry hesitates before he then accepts. Eddie and Henry then get into Eddie's car headed to the game, along with two men also in the back. Eddie appreciates Henry for agreeing to drive, though Henry seems quite comfortable doing it and tells him it's not a problem. Soon after, Eddie tells Henry that they're close to the stadium, but they needed to stop so he and the other guys could get some beer money from the ATM. He tells Henry to keep the car running, and then gets down with the two men, who then put on masks and bring out their guns before they then enter into a bank, but Henry doesn't see this. A while later, the bank's security alarm goes off and Eddie and the other guys have to run toward another route when they see a cop in front of the bank. It doesn't take long before the cop then spots Henry in the car wearing the same jersey as the robbers, and with that, he comes over and arrests him. Even though he didn't know about the robbery, Henry doesn't say anything to the detectives when he's being interrogated, and he would later get sentenced to 3 years in prison. Henry soon gets transferred to prison and is immediately given a cell, with his cellmate being a man named Max. Max and Henry do a little catching up in there. Henry tells Max he's in for a crime he didn't commit, and Max also says he got sentenced for life. Later that day during lunchtime, Max lectures Henry about how everyone in prison had a dream, and because they didn't fulfill their potential, they ended up in prison. He then asks Henry if he has a dream, and Henry responds saying he didn't have one, much to Max's surprise. 6 months after Henry has been in jail, Debbie comes over to see him, and after they have a really awkward reunion, she tells Henry that she's in love with someone else. Quite surprisingly, Henry looks happy as he says he's okay with it, and he only wants her to be happy. Months later, Henry and some of the other inmates are listening to Max as he's telling a joke about his most recent attempt to scare off the parole board so he could remain in prison. Henry then talks about his own review with the board coming up in a month, and that he was going to try his best to get released, with one of the inmates saying they all knew he didn't commit the crime he was in for. Another inmate named Hector then says that if he's already in prison, then he might have as well committed the crime, a statement that Max says he likes. Not long after, Henry's parole review gets accepted, and on the day he's leaving, he tells Max to try and also get out, but Max says he's fine in prison and he doesn't miss anything outside. When he leaves prison, Henry immediately goes to see Debbie to get his stuff, and he's surprised to see that her husband is Joe. Joe lets him in and Debbie also comes over to meet him, and there, Henry sees that she's pregnant. She then proceeds to take him to get his things, and he then thanks her. Joe soon meets them while they're at it, and he offers Henry a job, but Henry doesn't like the sound of the Ponzi-like business, so he rejects. Joe tells him to think about it, and he also thanks Henry for not reporting him to the police when he was caught, but Henry says he didn't even remember his name. After he leaves Joe and Debbie's house, Henry goes to the bank where he had been caught, and as he's not looking, he gets hit by a car, with the driver, a woman named Julie, coming out to yell at him and also ask if he's okay. A cop soon comes over to help, and it turns out to be the same cop that arrested him, and the cop also happens to remember Henry. Henry is then taken to a cafe just around, and there, the cop leaves him, and then Julie leaves too when Henry says he's fine. Suddenly, Henry's eye catches an old newspaper on the wall, with the headline news being about a robbery attempt on the bank, through an underground tunnel. He also sees that the whole seems to be connected from a theater across the street and into the bank. The next day, he then goes to prison to see Max, saying he already had a dream, and it was to rob the bank he was wrongly accused of robbing, and he wanted help from Max since his parole hearing was close and he could get out soon. Max likes the idea, but he's not too excited about the plan to leave prison, so he doesn't give Henry the answer he expected before he then leaves. From there, Henry goes over to the theater next to the bank and sees Julie rehearsing for a play on stage. The director doesn't seem impressed at one point, and Julie says she wants to leave to get coffee. As she's leaving, she's surprised to see Henry, who then follows her to the cafe. There, he commends her acting, and she then gets to know him and thank him for not suing her. Max's parole review day soon reaches, and he does exactly as Henry wanted him to, and gets freed, with Henry coming to pick him up. Together, they then go over to the cafe, where Max sounds a little pessimistic about the idea of going through a tunnel that might not even be there. He tells Henry that they can do it the old-fashioned way and go in with guns and rob the bank, but Henry says he's not interested in that as he doesn't want anyone to get hurt. Max still doesn't look happy about Henry's plan, so he asks that they go check out the bank. Inside, Max is kind of a sweet talker, and he manages to get the customer rep to tell him about the bank's vault and how long it had been there. From there, they then proceed to the theater. And as Henry is trying to show Max where he thinks the tunnel is, Julie comes out, sounding frustrated. She's surprised to see Henry again, and then gets introduced to Max, who forms a lie about performing at the theater back in the day. Max asks if it's fine to check out the theater, and Julie lets them in. Inside, Max continues his lie and even makes up names of shows he performed, with Julie looking really suspicious of him. Soon after, a man comes over to tell Julie some things about the show, and Max uses this opportunity to ask the man for a tour of the place, which the man agrees to. Julie and Henry then catch up, with Julie saying Max looked like Henry's dad, though Henry says Max is only his friend. Elsewhere, Max and his tour guide walk around the theater, and more cunningly, he gets the man to tell him about a secret room, the tunnel, and how it was connected to the bank, much to Max's delight. The man then takes Max to where the tunnel is, and as Max is acting like he's reminiscing about the old times, he hits the wall repeatedly to confirm that there's something after the wall, with the tour guide not even suspecting anything. When they're done with the tour, Max and the tour guide go back to meet Julie and Henry, just as Henry is telling her that he had just come home from jail. Max then says he's coming back the next day because he's going to start volunteering for the theater, much to Henry's surprise. When they're then leaving, Henry asks Julie out on a date and she accepts. A while later, after getting home, Henry starts preparing for his date as Max talks about what they're going to do to the dirt in the tunnel. Henry soon has to leave for the restaurant where he was having his date with Julie. She arrives late but apologizes, and then after eating, she talks about how she wanted to have a bigger legacy, and she was even thinking of moving to Hollywood. After the date, they go to a waterfall where Henry finally tells Julie about what got him into jail, and more interestingly, he tells her that he now wants to actually rob the bank. Julie is amused to hear him as she doesn't exactly believe him. However, they get ice cream and then head to Julie's apartment, where Henry gets to read a line from one of her scripts to please her, after which they make out. The next day, they return to Henry's apartment, and as Max hears the door, he immediately talks about his idea to get the dirt in the tunnel to the roof. As he comes to the living room, he's surprised to see Julie, but Henry tells him that she already knows the plan. With this, Max asks to see Henry privately, and when they're alone, Max is furious as he doesn't understand why Henry told her, but Henry is very calm and tells Max it was fine. They then go over to have breakfast, and there, Max talks about going to prison for being a con man. Henry also reads the line from Julie's script, and not only is she surprised that he knows it already, she calls him a natural. When she's leaving, Max asks Julie to give him a lift to the theater, and there, he tells Henry that he's bored and feeling useless when they could already be digging the dirt inside the tunnel. Henry tells him to remain calm, and then Max has an idea about getting access to the dressing room that had the hidden tunnel, asking him to play a role in Julie's play. Surprisingly, the man who used to play the role Max wanted for Henry quits, and Max uses this chance to tell Julie to help get Henry in front of the director since she already said he's a natural. She's surprised at his idea, but she eventually helps Henry get the role, and with that, Henry and Max are able to start breaking the wall to the tunnel. Quite unfortunately, the dirt is too much in the tunnel and they realize they need extra hands, so Henry reaches out to Joe, whose Ponzi-like business has crashed. Joe is happy to join the team, and the next day, they start work. Later on, Henry and Julie hook up, and there she figures out that he's not actually interested in robbing the bank for money. And he agrees, saying he only wanted to do something different from how he used to do things. One night after digging, they're stopped by the cop who arrested Henry. He tells the three men that he knows what they're planning, and that he wanted to join them. Max is curious about why he's suddenly interested, and the cop says he was retiring, and he wanted to do so with a bang, especially since the bank couldn't help him when his wife was dying. He says he'll be their man on the inside, and he also tells them the specific time when they can expect to get a huge amount of cash from the bank. Much later, Max and Henry are at home when they hear a knock on the door, and it's Joe, who looks injured, and with Eddie. Eddie talks about wanting to join their team to rob the bank, saying Joe told him everything. Max is furious and he almost attacks Eddie, but Henry stops him. The next day, Max and Henry arrive at the theater to see that the show's opening night was just a few days away. Henry is shocked to see this, and then he says he's no longer sure about robbing the bank, and that he didn't want to leave Julie, but Max convinces him to think otherwise. When they're digging that day, Henry also stops, and Max has to remind Henry that he left prison for Henry, and now he had to rob the bank for him. Max also mentioned the cop's retirement plan. Later that day, Henry tells Julie about robbing the bank on opening night and that he'd also be leaving afterwards. Julie feels betrayed and tells Henry exactly how she feels. She also cries and then asks him to leave. It's finally the day of the show and the money arrives at the bank just as the cop had said it would. Max, Henry, Eddie, and Joe get to work, with Henry acting and then going back to help. They're eventually able to recover all the money with ease while Henry is still acting, and quite surprisingly, Eddie brings out a gun and turns on them. When Max tries to fight him over it, Eddie knocks him down, and just then Henry comes in to see what's happening. Max is soon able to get a hold of Eddie's gun, but in the process, Henry gets shot in the leg, though Max is then able to knock Eddie out. Around the same time, Henry hears that it's his time to come on stage and he's unsure about what to do with his leg, but somehow he manages to walk on stage and play his role well enough. Eventually, Eddie is tied and then locked back in the tunnel, while Henry, Joe, and Max are able to get to the car and leave. As they're leaving, Henry asks Joe to stop the car, and even though he hesitates, Joe eventually does. Henry then gets out and tells Max that he has got to leave and go back to meet Julie. Max is disappointed, but he wishes Henry good luck and says they'll be seeing each other later in the future. With that, Max and Joe leave, and Henry returns to the show and climbs the stage immediately. He starts telling Julie that he came back for her, and he wanted them to be together and leave for Moscow. As it's not part of the show, Julie has to improvise and try to get Henry off stage, but he doesn't accept as he continues to say that he loves her and wants to be with her. However, the audience doesn't seem fazed by the change in content as they still remain interested, with someone even calling for Julie to accept. Seeing as the show had likely reached a good end, the director calls for the lights to be dimmed, and he also tells Julie to say yes. She, however, just gives Henry a look to show him her answer. And that is how it ended. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.